We welcome you back to this channel. Today we'll hear stories of malevolent imaginary friends. We'll take you through the tales of those who discovered that their imaginary friends weren't as harmless as they thought. Go ahead, turn off the lights, and let's take one more step into the world of the unknown.
The Dark Guardian.
It all started when my sister asked me to look after her son, George, for a few days. I accepted without a second thought since I've always had a close relationship with George. He's a charming little boy, about 5 years old. However, from the moment I arrived at the house, I noticed something strange about him. His behavior wasn't the same as usual. George often talked to himself, laughing and murmuring things I couldn't understand. When I asked him who he was talking to, he simply smiled and replied, "With Michael, he's my friend." I didn't think much of it. After all, it's common for children to have imaginary friends. What unsettled me was the way George talked about him. According to my nephew, Michael wasn't a child but claimed to be much older. That night, as I tucked him in, he asked me to leave his bedroom door open. "Michael wants the door to stay open. He says he can watch better that way," he said with total ease. My heart raced, but I didn't want to scare my nephew, so I agreed to his request. "It's just a child's imagination," I kept telling myself, but there was a heaviness in the air. Around 3 in the morning, I was awakened by the sound of laughter coming from George's room. I quickly got up and went to see what was happening. When I opened the door, I found him standing in the middle of the room, staring intently at the dark corner. The room was freezing, and I felt an invisible presence watching me. I tried to stay calm and asked him what he was doing awake at that hour. What he said left me cold. Michael wanted to play. That's when I saw it. A tall, deformed figure with sunken, empty eyes slowly emerging from the darkness. It seemed to be made of shadows. Its distorted shape hard to define, but its presence was overwhelming. There was no doubt, this wasn't an imaginary friend. Terror paralyzed me for a moment. George, on the other hand, showed no fear, as if it was the most normal thing in the world. "Michael wants you to leave," he said, still staring at the figure. At that moment, I knew I had to get my nephew out of there as quickly as possible. With a speed I didn't know I possessed, I grabbed his hand and led him out of the room. As we ran down the hallway, I felt the presence following us, a chilling air filling the atmosphere as if the very darkness was chasing us. We took refuge in my room where I locked the door. George, strangely calm, simply said, "Michael is angry." The door began to rattle, as if someone was trying to force their way in. I could see the shadow starting to slide under the door, beginning to take shape inside my room. George stood still, unresponsive. The shadow was tall and thick, almost reaching the ceiling, and its eyes were a deep, intense red. I was paralyzed, unable to stop thinking about how to escape and protect George. All I could do was hug him tightly and scream with all my might until that shadow disappeared. I didn't sleep at all that night, keeping the lamp on and watching every corner of the room, hoping that the thing I had seen wouldn't find its way in. The next day, I called my sister and asked her to return as soon as possible. I didn't give her many details, just that something wasn't right and that I needed them to come back. George was strange, quieter than usual, but he didn't seem as affected as I was. When my sister and her husband arrived, I tried to explain what had happened, but I couldn't find the right words without sounding crazy. I simply told them that George had been talking to someone who wasn't there, and that it had scared me. They took it calmly, assuring me that imaginary friends were normal at his age. I begged my sister to take my words seriously. Something evil was dwelling in her house and was affecting George. I could see in her eyes that she looked at me with disbelief. I left their house feeling like I had left something dark behind, something that shouldn't have been ignored. I spoke with my sister a few days later. She told me that indeed, George had been acting strangely. She hadn't seen anything, but her husband had seen that entity in my nephew's room. They had put the house up for sale and were going to a hotel. They weren't going to set foot in that house again. I saw George again that same afternoon, and he was back to being the happy little boy he always was. But something in me had changed. I still have nightmares about that dark figure, with those empty eyes watching me from the corner. I feel like something stayed with me, something that doesn't want to leave. And sometimes, in the darkness of the night, I feel its gaze on me, waiting, watching.
Thomas's shadow.
Since my son Charles turned 5, he started talking about an imaginary friend named Thomas. At first, I didn't give it much importance. After all, many children invent friends to play with. However, Thomas's presence became increasingly unsettling. At first, it was small things. Toys I found in strange places, like building blocks perfectly stacked in the kitchen, or drawings that Charles hadn't done before, with firm strokes and odd shapes. When I asked him, he just smiled and said, "Thomas helped me." I remember one night in particular. I woke up to a loud thud, as if something had fallen in Charles's room. I ran to his room and found him sitting on his bed, staring intently at his open closet. My eyes struggled to adjust to the dim light, and what I saw sent a chill down my spine. A shadow, a barely perceptible figure outlined inside the closet. It was a shape that was almost human, too tall and thin, with long arms that nearly touched the floor. "Thomas is very upset," Charles whispered, without taking his eyes off the figure. I quickly turned on the light, but the shadow was already gone. My son looked at me with his big, innocent eyes, as if he didn't understand why I was so frightened. I swallowed the fear that was choking me and took him to sleep with me that night. The incidents became more frequent and disturbing. The doors in the house would slam shut for no apparent reason, lights would flicker, and whispers seemed to come from everywhere, unintelligible words that seemed to twist in the air. But the worst part was when I started seeing Thomas with my own eyes. I was in the living room, going through some papers, when I saw a figure pass by in the hallway. At first, I thought it was Charles, but on closer inspection, I realized it was much taller. Its silhouette was blurry, as if it were shrouded in a dark mist, and its eyes were two deep, pitch-black spots that watched me from the shadows. Panic paralyzed me, and by the time I managed to move, it had disappeared. I ran to Charles's room, but he was sleeping peacefully. I started researching more about imaginary friends. I read about children who spoke of similar figures, but none of the stories ended well. All those friends seemed to be something much more sinister, something that fed on children's fear. I didn't know what to do or who to turn to. Things got worse when Charles began to change. His behavior became erratic, aggressive. He stopped being the sweet child he'd always been and started whispering things we couldn't understand, words in an unknown language. One night, as I was trying to sleep, I heard Charles laughing from his room. It was a distorted laugh, one that didn't sound natural in his voice. I rushed to his room, but what I saw left me breathless. Charles was standing in the middle of the room, surrounded by a dark shadow that moved as if it had a life of its own. "Dad, Thomas wants to play with you," Charlie said to me, in a voice that didn't seem like his own. I don't know where I found the strength, but I moved toward him. I took Charles's hand, trying to pull him out of that trance, to wrench him from the clutches of that thing. I pulled hard, and we both fell to the floor, and the shadow vanished. Charles was unconscious on the floor. We rushed him to the hospital, but the doctors couldn't explain what had happened. They ran some tests, but everything was fine, and 2 days later, we returned home. I contacted a priest who told me that the best thing we could do was perform a ritual to cleanse the house and drive that evil shadow away. That same afternoon, he came to our house, calmly walked through it with his Bible in hand until he reached Charles's room, where he stopped. Thomas was there, towering, darker and taller than ever. The priest said a prayer, raising his voice, and Thomas's shadow began to lose strength, gradually fading until With a deep, guttural scream, it disappeared. The next day, Charles had no memory of what had happened. My wife and I decided not to talk about that bad experience. Charles never mentioned Thomas again, and little by little, he started to regain his usual personality, and things at home calmed down. I don't really know how Thomas came to our house, but I know that the experience I lived through will stay with me forever. Even today, after several years, I could swear that some nights, I can see a shadow peeking in from outside my son's window, watching, waiting for the moment to come back in.
Sinister laughter.
For as long as I can remember, I was always a solitary child. I could spend hours playing alone, inventing worlds and characters that I talked to as if they were real. One of them was called Christopher. I remember Christopher appearing when I was about 6 years old. We had just moved into an old house on the outskirts of town, a big place with rooms full of antique furniture and dark corners that seemed to hold secrets. My parents quickly noticed that I spent a lot of time talking to myself, even though I insisted that Christopher was with me. "He's just an imaginary friend," they would say. But I knew that Christopher was real. I could feel him close, right beside me. One night before bed, I heard Christopher whisper my name. Then I heard it again, louder this time. "Come with me," he said. "I want to show you something." I got up without thinking, as if an invisible force was pushing me. I followed him silently through the house until we reached the basement. Next to the door was Christopher. He was tall, thin, with strangely pale skin and dark eyes that seemed to look beyond what was visible. His hair was dark, and there was always a grimace on his lips, like a crooked smile. The basement was a place I had never dared to go alone. It was dusty and dark. Christopher led me to a corner where there was an old wooden door that I had never noticed before. "Open it," he said. With trembling hands, I opened the door. On the other side, there was nothing but darkness, and I felt an intense cold run through my entire body. Christopher stood beside me, staring at me with those dark, piercing eyes. "Go in," he ordered. I don't remember much after that, just fragments. An overwhelming cold, a feeling of being watched by something I couldn't see, and Christopher's laughter. A cold, sinister laugh. I don't know how long I was there, but when my parents found me, I was trembling, curled up in a corner of the basement, unable to speak. After that night, things changed. Christopher was still with me, but he wasn't the friend I once knew. He became more demanding, more controlling. He would wake me in the middle of the night, whispering in my ear, asking me to do things that terrified me. He told me that if I didn't, something bad would happen to my family. I started having nightmares, dreams where I was trapped in that basement, with something stalking me from the shadows, something that wanted to take me with it. And always, in every dream, there was Christopher, watching me from a corner with that twisted grin on his face. My parents began to worry. They noticed I was no longer the cheerful child I once was. They took me to doctors, to psychologists, and they all said the same thing. "He's just an imaginary friend. It's normal. He'll disappear in time." But Christopher didn't disappear. He was there, always there, waiting, whispering, manipulating me. One day, after one of those nightmares, I decided to confront him. I yelled at him, told him I hated him, that I wanted him to leave me alone. But he just laughed. "You can't get rid of me," he said. "I'm part of you." That was the last time I saw him. After that night, Christopher vanished, but the fear never left. I grew up with the feeling that something was always watching me, that I was never truly alone. And though I never saw him again, sometimes, in the darkness, when I'm alone at home, I feel his presence. A cold chill running down my spine, a laugh echoing in my dreams. Now, years later, I still wonder what Christopher really was. Was he just a product of my childhood mind, or something much more sinister? Something that managed to enter my life by taking advantage of a child's loneliness and fear? But there's one thing I'm sure of. Christopher wasn't just an imaginary friend. He was real. And whatever he was, he's still there, waiting, in the darkness.
Thank you for journeying with us through the dark passages of these stories. If you enjoyed them, give us a like, share, and subscribe so you don't miss more tales of terror. Until next time, where fear will once again be your companion.